I'm going to try to break this down because I don't want to spend multiple weeks on the life of Joseph, even though we could. Now, Joseph is the last story in the book of Genesis, and it's pretty cool on the stuff that starts to happen. And so I want you to think about it this way. Back in the day when they were writing your Genesis and your scrolls, your books that we call them now, they're scrolls, they didn't have chapters or verses. And so what the writers would do is they would put in like similar themes to help you memorize it. And so Jacob starts to weave all of these stories that started happening in Genesis together, and it helps us memorize his story. So I want to connect a few of those dots for you. And the story of Joseph, if you don't know, Joseph, I wrote Jacob, good day. Nobody was going to correct me either. Yeah, goodness. I was so proud of how I wrote that. Joseph, don't. Did I? Okay. Joseph, when you meet him, the very first chapter is going to be Genesis 37. He's 17 years old. Big thing that Joseph has as a 17-year-old is he's going to have two dreams. Joseph's first dream he tells to his brothers. He tells them that in the dream that they are out collecting wheat, and all of his brothers' wheat that they've collected goes and bows down before Joseph's wheat. Well, his brothers hated him, did not like that dream. Remember that Joseph's a teenager. If you think back to when you were a teenager, you weren't the wisest in how you acted, and you probably, if you were the favorite, flaunted it. So Joseph's kind of a little punk when we meet him, but he gets better. He has another dream, and that this time it's like the universe and all of these planets and everything bow down to Joseph. Now, this time in that second dream, he tells his dad that his dad is going to be one of the ones that bow down to him, right? And so Jacob, his dad, puts an end to that and says, "You've done lost your mind, child. I'm not bowing down to you." That's right. And so that's how the story of Joseph starts off. We learned that pretty quickly that Joseph was the favorite, that there's sibling rivalry, there's two dreams, and then the siblings plot to kill Joseph, right? And then there's going to be a lie to cover it up, and then they're going to lie using a goat. But here's what I want you to connect. I want you to think through the story of Genesis, all of the people that we've looked at so far. When we talk about siblings that had favorites, what other sibling pairs had favorites in the book of Genesis? Esau. There we go. And Isaac. Yes. Now, you can't remember. Isaac is the favorite because Ishmael is born first, but then Sarah kicks Ishmael out. Y'all remember that story, okay? All right, now let's think back to sibling rivalry. Think all the way back into the Genesis. Who else had sibling rivalries in Genesis? Cain and Abel. Someone put C and H. Real bad. That's right. Cain and Abel. Who else? There's one we've already written down. Joseph and his brothers. Yes. Jacob and Esau. Okay. Now, what other person in the book of Genesis also had a dream? Pharaoh does, yes, but think of the patriarchs. It's going to be, I'll help you with this one. Does Abraham? Jacob does. Jacob has a dream. And then, what siblings plot to kill each other? Or not kill each other. What one sibling plots to kill the other sibling? Cain and Abel. And then I heard the other one as well. Jacob and Esau. Okay? Now, let's think back through all of our stories. Where is lying involved in all of our stories? All of them. Yes. All of them. So you have Adam and Eve. You have Abraham. You have Isaac lies. You have Jacob. So lying is a big theme that's traced throughout all of these stories. Where did I write that? Oh, yep. Yes. No. Isaac was right. I wrote it down because Isaac's the favorite. So Esau. Yeah. I'm sorry. Look, to save time, I didn't write out everything. So I just put one story. Sorry. That's my bad. All right. And then let's think back. Who covered themselves in a goat to trick their father? Remember? Jacob did. Now, when the brothers get together, so this is what happens in the story. Joseph's the favorite. He already has two dreams. The brothers cannot stand him. They hate him. And Joseph's the favorite because Joseph and Benjamin are the children of Joseph's favorite wife, Rachel. So then this starts a sibling rivalry. The dreams make it worse. And then one day, Jacob is going to send Joseph out to find his brothers. And as he comes in and they can see him from far off, they say, it's time. We're sick of him. He's got his coat on. Let's kill him. So then they say, all right, we're going to kill him. Reuben, the oldest, steps in. Reuben says, we probably shouldn't do that. It's going to kill our father if we do that. So what we'll do is, his goal was to try to save him, but then his brothers end up selling him to descendants of Ishmael. And then they're going to lie to cover it up. And then they lie using a goat. So they take his coat from him as he gets there. He's stripped of his coat. They kill a goat, they dip it in the blood, and they bring it back to their dad, and they say, he's been killed. Okay? But they actually didn't kill him. Is this good? So look, this is all these themes. I think it's really cool because this is, as a writer, he's bringing all these themes in together. So you're starting to see all this stuff that's come together in the book of Genesis. Now, continues here. Now, this cloak. We first met the cloak. Joseph has a cloak that distinguishes him from all of his brothers. It's a coat of many colors, a coat of many patterns. Back then, if you had a coat of many colors, it symbolized you're rich because you couldn't have afforded that unless you had really a lot of money. And so every time a cloak is mentioned, change happens in Jacob. So if you think back to movies, sometimes they'll show you something before something changes, right? So if you're thinking plots, there might always be a clock that they show, and then the story kind of changes. Joseph has that same thing, but it's a cloak. So in Genesis 37:23, we're first introduced to the cloak at the beginning of 37, but when it's brought up again, they strip him of the cloak and they throw him into the pit. So Joseph goes from being the favorite, well-off, to being thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. The next time a cloak is mentioned is Genesis 39, because now Joseph goes to Egypt, and when he's in Egypt, Potiphar's wife has the hots for Jacob and wants to commit adultery with him. And so she grabs his cloak. Grabs his cloak as he runs away, and he does the right thing, gets out of there, tries to honor his master. But as she grabs the cloak, what happens? Comes off, and then she uses it to lie. And then that gets Jacob thrown into prison. So every time so far that cloak gets mentioned, Jacob takes a step down. Then, in Genesis 41, as he's in prison, he's going to have two dreams again. Two people are going to have dreams. It's going to be the king's cupbearer and the king's bread maker. The Pharaoh, Pharaoh. And so they come to him with two dreams. Joseph tells them what their dreams mean. One of them is killed, the bread maker. The cupbearer lives and is restored back into the Pharaoh's good graces. He goes back to his original job. And then he's forgotten. But then, if we know the story, Pharaoh has a dream himself, freaks out about the dream, and then that cupbearer remembers. And he says, oh, there was a guy in prison. He told me what my dream meant, Pharaoh. He can tell you what your dream means. And so then this cloak is reintroducing in Genesis 41, because then he's picked up, all of his hair is shaved, and then they give him a new cloak. And then he goes, and that's when he's restored back in, and he becomes the second most powerful man in all of the land. So this cloak, anytime you're reading the story, a cloak is going to symbolize change. So I just want to point that out. I thought it was pretty cool. You might think it's ridiculous. Well, Bruce, why are you telling me this? I just think it's cool. All right. So Joseph, in his story, there's going to be the idea of exile, and Joseph's going to be the one that starts the idea of the suffering servant. In the Old Testament, suffering servant is going to become Jesus. The Messiah is called the suffering servant. It's planted, and that seed starts with Jacob. Okay? I'm not going to develop that much because it's a lot of Hebrew, and I'm sure you guys don't want to know Hebrew. So, it starts with this. Genesis 37:14 is when we first introduced to Joseph. His father sends him out from the highland and sends him down into the valley. Genesis 37:24, his brothers strip him of his cloak and throw him into a pit, down into a pit. Then in Genesis 39, remember, they're not going to have like GPS and all the maps that we do, but he goes down to Egypt. Okay, so he's down, out, down. Genesis 39:19-20 is when he stands up for doing the right thing, does not sleep with Potiphar's wife. He's thrown down into prison. And then in Genesis 40:23, Joseph interprets the dreams, but he's forgotten. He's down out of the mountain. So there's this constant descent for Joseph. He's down. He's suffering through this, but in Genesis 41, he's redeemed. As he gets redeemed, then he becomes the second most powerful man. He is able to use God's wisdom that he's given him, and he's able to save Egypt and God's people that come down, which is going to be his brother and their families. He's able to save everybody in the area. So that's pretty much your story of Joseph. I'm going to draw us to two things. So I gave you a real brief overview. Does anybody have any questions about anything so far? Okay. All right. When they get back and he's introduced to his brothers, just to let you know as you read that, he puts his brothers through the same test that they put him through. So if you know the story, then Joseph finds his brothers. They come to him to try to get grain and everything because the land is barren. And so when they're before him, they pay him for the grain, and then he gives them the money back. So in their eyes, yes, secretly. And so in their eyes, they think that they've been stealing from him, right? And so this is the second most powerful man probably in the whole world at this moment. And so they've done messed up big time in their eyes. And so the point is as he puts that back, he also holds one of the brothers back, and he holds Benjamin, which is his brother. And so as he sends them out, they have the money. So if we think about the stories, kind of put them out. They sold Joseph to slavers, so they're out a brother and they've got money, right? He goes through and he does the same thing. He takes out a brother and he gives them their money back. See how it's the same test? So they lose a brother, but they get their money back. And so he's seeing if they're going to do the same thing that they did to him. Are you going to take the money and run, or are you going to be honest with, have you changed? Did you learn from what happened? And so then they go to Jacob, the dad, and they all come back. And then that's when Joseph breaks it down and he shares with Judah. And Judah's the one that had the bad idea. Judah's the one that came up with the idea to kill Jacob or Joseph. Judah is the one that came up with the idea to kill Joseph. And so that's a really sweet moment, right? I think it's pretty cool because Judah's the one that originally wanted to kill Joseph. Judah's the one that wanted to kill Joseph. And now when there's this moment where Joseph can get revenge, Joseph breaks down. And so he's forgiven him. Anyways, I'm going to bring us to two spots, and I want us to kind of sit there for a moment and think about this. Genesis 39:20. Genesis 39:20. Now, when you see that verse, it's kind of divided up. At least in my Bible, it's divided up into two kind of sections. We're going to start in the second half. For me, it starts a brand new paragraph. Y'all see that? So I'm going to start in the middle of that verse. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him, and he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So Joseph does the right thing, stands up, defends Potiphar, doesn't sleep with his wife. He gets thrown into prison, and this is the verse that follows, that the Lord remembers him. So the point that I want to try to point out to everybody is that God didn't prevent any of this bad stuff from happening. And I think a lot of times when we follow Jesus, we think that our lives are going to be easier. And in this story, God doesn't stop to prevent any of the evil that Joseph experiences. What God does promise to do, and what he's doing right here, is he's with Joseph in the suffering. And so it's just a point that I wanted to show you guys. God could have easily stopped it, right? God could have easily just prevented his brothers from selling him into slavery. He could have prevented Potiphar's wife from lying about him, but he doesn't. God has promised to be with Joseph through it all, in the same way that he promises to be with you through it all. So that's one of them. And then I want us to look at Genesis 50:20. So this is at the very end of the book of Genesis. And then I'll make one last connection and you guys are done. It says, so Joseph is talking to his brothers. His brothers now know that this is Joseph. They've been restored to one another. And then he says, we'll start in verse 19. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And so Joseph has forgiven, but what's I think is pretty awesome is that the brothers intended very evil things to happen to Joseph. And Joseph experienced evil after evil. Remember, he went down into the pit, down, down. And yet God uses that and weaves his redemption through all of those evil things that happened to him. And so as you have evil things that happen to you, it doesn't mean that God can't redeem those and change them into something that's amazing. But I think we've got to change our mindset a little bit. Because I know that when I follow God, there's expectations where he's going to prevent that evil stuff from happening. But the story of Scripture is not that he always prevents it. Sometimes he does. But the story that we see more often is that there might be bad things that happen, but God redeems them and weaves something beautiful into it. And so for each of you, you may be going through different things, or maybe you've gone through difficult things in the past, and you're asking why. I can't give you a why, but I can promise you that God's going to be with you. I can promise you that God can redeem those into something that was not expected. Joseph had those 2 dreams, but I want you to put yourself in Joseph's shoes. At any point, do you think that where do you think your mind would be if you were like, now I'm sold into a pit, or I'm thrown into a pit, then I have to be sold down into Egypt, Potiphar's wife lies for me. Do you think that at any point he's thinking those dreams are going to come true? Probably not. And so God redeems all of that, though. I think that's really cool. So that's my challenge for you. The story of Joseph is one of the best. I mean, it ends, the book of Genesis. If we start to pull back everything, where are they supposed to be? What did God promise Abraham? He was to have a great people. He was to be a great blessing. And what else was the last promise that God gave him? Descendants. Okay, so be fruitful and multiply. We're going to come back to that. Land. All right, so where are they at the end of Genesis? Are they in Egypt? They're not in the promised land. So God has sent his people out, in large part because if we've looked at the story, Abraham lies multiple times, Isaac lies multiple times, Jacob did all types of wrong things. And so the story is like you're waiting for things to get better, and it's bad thing after bad thing after bad thing. And then we finally meet Joseph, and there's not many bad things that are said about Joseph. So now it ends on this high note where you're like, finally God's people are starting to get it right, but they're out of the promised land. That's the tension that it builds. And so there's a lot of other cool stuff. At the very end of the book, it talks about their generations. So they're being fruitful and multiplying. And so it's this idea that they're forming their own Eden, the Garden of Eden. Remember Genesis 1 or Genesis 2? Garden of Eden, there's now this remnant. And God's blessing them and planting them a new garden there to be with him until the promised land comes back up. So I won't go any further. I just love, there's a lot of really cool, just little bits and pieces here where they're trying to show you that even though things look bad, Joseph's this redeeming story, and then God's still with him, which is the story of the Garden of Eden. We are with God. God is with them. And then I'll pay attention, verse 26. The last word, even in Hebrew, is Egypt. So then it sets you up for the book of Exodus, because that's where it picks off. They're in Egypt. So it kind of sets his attention. If you're reading this as a book, we treat Scripture differently, and we should. But if you're reading this as a book, normally you'd start to kind of put some pieces together. You're like, whoa, whoa, whoa! But they're not supposed to be in Egypt. They're supposed to be in the Promised Land. And so Exodus is them coming back to that. Yes. Anyways, that's it. My encouragement, again, just think of Joseph's life. Joseph, there's not a lot of bad things that are said about Joseph. The really only bad thing that we get about Joseph is he's kind of a punk at the very beginning because he's a teenager. And he brags about it to his brothers. But it goes out of its way to show you that Joseph could have slept with Potiphar's wife, and he doesn't. Joseph could have done bad things while he was in prison, but he doesn't. And so it's this Joseph we finally see as this mature believer in God. But Joseph has the most bad things happen to him. So don't count out the bad stuff that's happened to you. All right.
It's the old saying, a lot of bad things happen to good people.
Mm-hmm.
That's Joseph.
Yes. Yep. I mean, you can get, well, I won't. I'll let you guys go early. Okay. Let me pray for you, and then you're dismissed. God, we just come to you, and Lord, thank you for the book of Genesis and just how important these stories are. And Lord, help us just to read through these and reflect on them, and God, to think about the times where we want you to stop bad things that are happening to us or prevent them from happening. And yet, God, you might have a purpose and be able to redeem the things that are happening to us, and you promise to be with us. So help us to trust you, to lean into you, and just to have that relationship with you, to know that it's the most important thing is to be with you, not bad things to happen to us. So God, I pray that you be with us, walk with us, and I ask these things in your name. Amen.